Today on The Real Story, $1 million for Connecticut's towns, how this money will be used to process a possible influx of absentee ballots as we look ahead to the November election. Plus, could these absentee ballots mean more voter fraud? We're talking with an expert to get you the answers on election security. Good Sunday morning, and thanks for joining us on The Real Story. I'm Fox 61's political reporter, Emma Wolforst. Now, November's ballot is set, but that doesn't necessarily mean you'll be standing in a voting booth. This week, the Secretary of the State announced a $1 million grant to support the 2022 general election. The money will be divided between all towns and cities to help election workers mail, process, and count absentee ballots. The state anticipates a potentially larger number of absentee ballots return this year. Joining me now to talk more about what this grant means for Connecticut's elections, Vice President of the Connecticut Town Clerks Association, Patricia Spruance. Thanks for being here, Patricia.
Thank you, Emma.
So what is this absentee ballot support grant? What is it going to do for town clerks?
Right. So in 2020, we had an unprecedented number of absentee ballots. And so it is as a result of that the legislature was very responsive and have worked with the towns, and they saw that there was a need to continue to support the towns. And so the applications now permit for someone to mark a box that allows them to vote by absentee. It is the box sickness. And so if you fear perhaps getting sick or you have not been feeling well, you can utilize that. In the past, the items that you could choose were very restrictive. And so if you did not meet that criteria, you really had to go to the polls. And so this allows for an expansion of the absentee ballots. Now, the situation is that it's costly to perform that function in a town. And so the state has come forth with these monies to come alongside the towns and to help us.
Absolutely. And did towns know this money was coming? When did you find out about this grant?
No, it was, we were very happy. There was a meeting with Secretary of State, Mark Kohler, and we were delighted to hear of this news. What they did is they took the number of ballots that were received by towns in the 2020 election as well as the 2018 election. They've averaged that, and so they've come up with a formula. And from that, then the towns will be compensated. And so I work for the town of Windham, and we had over 2,600 ballots, absentee ballots received in 2020. And in 18, we had 243 absentee ballots. So you can see the vast difference. So that was averaged out. We'll be receiving just over $3,800 to
for your town,
for just our town. And so that's how it was leveraged amongst
so that formula to
169 towns.
How much money each of the towns is going to get, because that's just $1 million for the whole state.
Yes.
Gotcha. And what is this money going to be used for? As you mentioned, you're also town clerk for Windham. What do town clerks do? What will this money actually be used for?
So we have a terrific system in the state of Connecticut because it is very driven by individuals. We have 169 town clerks. We have 169 Republican registrar voters, and we have 169 Democratic registrars of voters. And so we have a lot of eyes, but it is a paper-driven system. And so that takes time, and it takes a lot of effort. So the first thing that someone does is they obtain an application in order to obtain an absentee ballot. And that can be obtained through the Secretary of State's website or through your town website or in person from your town clerk. So once you have filled out that application, we are able to send you a ballot. And that ballot, again, will be, it has envelopes, it has an inner envelope, it has an outer envelope, it has the ballot instructions, and so we need people to process that. and we enter that into our computer system. Our elections management system has our results. We use our voter registration system. And so things are so well documented. And that money allows us to have the personnel that we need. Perhaps extra folks need to be hired during that season.
So mostly going towards salaries for those workers.
Yes. It'll cover overtime. It'll cover the employment of part-time people to help us during that time. Sometimes you need the cities need perhaps extra facilities or areas rented to keep these things. So we are it's just a wonderful way of assisting the town clerks. That was one of our concerns. If we're going to handle more absentee ballots, then we need assistance with the cost.
Right, so it's physical people processing those paper ballots. I know a lot of times we think of voting tabulation machines and it's all being done by a machine counter these days, but when it comes to these absentee ballots, physical people processing those?
Well, they will go through the tabulator, yes, and so the town clerks administrate the absentee ballots, we get them ready, and then we pass that on to the register of voters. And so then they are the ones who have their teams to open them up and to then process them.
Still needs to be a little bit hands-on.
Yes, it is.
Absolutely. So the 2020 election was the first in state history with this no excuse absentee voting, meaning every resident could vote via that absentee ballot if they chose to do so. In that election, the state says over 665,000 Connecticut residents decided to vote by absentee ballot. Voter turnout in 2020's general election, nearly 80% here in Connecticut. Now, that was a presidential election. We have to factor that in. That's always a little bit more voter turnout than your midterms or your primaries. But do you think that high voter turnout had to do with that option of no excuse absentee voting?
Yes, absolutely. People were very frightened in terms of what their exposure could mean to their families and to themselves. And so, yes, I think it was very appropriate given the uncertainties that we were living in 2020. I don't anticipate that we will see the same numbers moving forward because the polls are open and the registrars do a fabulous job ensuring that it's a safe and easily accessible to their voters. And so you will have choices, and that's what it should be.
So you mentioned there, led me to one of my next questions, voter turnout. You said you don't anticipate to see quite as many people voting overall or via absentee?
Via absentee ballot. I think we will still have a good turnout and higher than we have in previous years. But 2020, it just seemed to be a special time where people were, the vaccines weren't as available, and there's still a concern, but things are much more open.
So possibly fewer absentee in this November's general because people are more comfortable coming to the polls in person?
I think that's correct.
Okay, so we talked about voter turnout, and for primaries, they usually have lower turnout than the general elections, about averaging 30% here in Connecticut. 2020's primary, about 27% voter turnout, right around that average. But this year, unofficial data from the state shows turnout for this primary was just 16%. Do we think lack of no excuse absentee ballot voting could have been a factor here?
No, I think that the factor had to do, it was a smaller race, and many of the people weren't familiar with the candidates, and it's a smaller race, and it just seemed to fall into an area and a time of year that voter turnout was less than anticipated.
Right. And you talked at the start about expanding those options for absentee voting, and we're back to no longer having the no excuse from 2020 and 2021. Would you talk a little bit about what the options are now for people if they qualify? Yes.
So in 2020, we had the COVID-19 excuse given, reason that one could choose. What we have now in our selections within our application is it continues to be active service in the armed forces as before, absence from the town of residence, sickness, religious tenets and duties as a primary election official, or physical disability. And so again, under those reasons, you have a little more room, you have much more room in which to make a decision.
So those expanded reasons, the reason why the state is expecting to see more absentee ballots returned in November this year?
Yes, the fact that people can mark things that would be relevant to their state of life and state of condition and allow them to access the absentee ballot.
And when it comes to Connecticut residents filling out an application, how does the state or the town clerks review those reasons?
Yeah, so it is, we speak with our residents when they come in. I encourage residents to call their town clerks, and town clerks are very helpful. And so if there's any question on how to fill it out and where to sign, you need to go ahead and make that phone call, and we're happy to help people along that process. But it's one where you put in that information and you can drop it off at a drop box. The drop boxes in each town are now open, and so you can put it in the drop box, and then we collect them daily and process. We issue your ballot right away. It'll be out in that night's mail. Now, we're also working with the Postal Service, and so I'm very thankful again. Connecticut has run a very tight ship when it comes to elections, and it's been my delight. And we now, every ballot that goes out, as we bundle them to go out in the mail, they have these green tags, and these green tags alert the Postal Service that this is election material, and it moves it right along.
And can people apply starting now, even though we're still a little ways away?
Yes, they can. You can now start applying. October 7th, that Friday, we can begin issuing absentee ballots, but you can certainly turn in your application now, because then we'll have them ready to go.
Great. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us, Patricia.
Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity.
Of course, coming up on The Real Story, could more absentee ballots mean a higher risk of election fraud this November? I'll speak with an election security expert to break it all down.